Okay, guys. We are starting a new topic today on the cost of production. We're going to be looking at the supply side of the market. So next time we'll talk about perfect competition, and that's also supply side of the market. So we're discussing producers and how they make decisions. And I don't know why that bag of money is on the slide. So let's just keep it in there. It's all about money after all, right? So, production, the process that converts input into output. Okay, inputs into production include things like capital and labor, our resources. Capital, like in order to make this nice little coffees, we need coffee machines, we need space, and we actually need some supplies too, like coffees and sugars and creams and cups. So, and we need labor, such as people who work and make all this together. We also need entrepreneurial abilities, to be more precise. So somebody, like an owner of production, that puts it all together. And we can also say that we need land, which is a code word for space, the rental space. So technically not capital, but called land. Outputs in case of coffee is just our cups of coffee. Maybe a little sweet thingies like donuts with it. So production is sometimes explained or described by a production function, such as Q, which is our output or quantity produced, is a function of capital and labor. Okay, so we can look at production in the long run and in the short run. And the question is, what's the difference? What do we mean by long run and short run? So in the long run, something is fixed. So we're not fast enough changing something. So if you're in a coffee place, it won't happen overnight that you will expand. So you will decide to expand your production and double the size of your coffee place, and you can't do it overnight. So in the short run, some production input is fixed, and usually that's capital. So it may take you a few months, up to 6 months, 7 months, a year to expand. So that is short run. And then in the long run, everything is flexible. All your inputs into production can change. So you can both capital and labor, so you can hire more people and you can buy more machines. So in some industries, short run is very short, such as a lawn mowing business. All it takes is a trip to Home Depot and maybe you need a new truck. So within a week, you can expand your capacity and service twice as many clients. So your output can double within a week. Whereas for, let's say, an airplane manufacturer, it takes several years to expand facilities. So, but in the short run, something like capital is fixed. Sometimes labor is fixed. I'll give you an example, a strange somewhat example where labor is fixed in the short run, whereas capital is flexible. So a total product curve shows how the quantity of output depends on the quantity of variable input. And here's an example of a total product curve right here for us. So example number 1, Paul is a surgeon. The information in the table contains his production function. So we have quantity of labor that's needed to produce a certain amount of output, which is the number of surgeries. It can be an oral surgeon, right? So we often see in a dental office several rooms. So that is measured by the operating room. So he is popping wisdom teeth or something like this, right? So when he has a room number 1, room number 2, number 3, and number 4, he can have those rooms. Not necessarily that he will end up having them, but suppose he can be in room 1 or 2 or 3, but he has a limited number of hours that he works. Say he works 30 hours per week and he needs 10 more hours to file his paperwork. So 30 hours in surgery. If he is to spend if he is to spend 30 hours but have no rooms at all, he'll produce 0 surgeries. If he takes his available time, 30 hours, and uses it on 1 room, he can produce 15 surgeries per unit of time per week. Then with 2 rooms, he can increase it to 25, with 3 rooms to 32, and with 4 rooms to 35. Notice the limited resource in this case is not his capital, which can be variable to a certain extent, but his time, 30 hours constraint. And that one he cannot expand overnight, although he may hire a different surgeon. How do you hire a different surgeon? You would probably partner with a different surgeon and have 60 hours, but they won't be his hours, right? It's somebody else's problem set. So we can put it on the graph and see that. Oh, interesting sound. On the graph, we have number of capital, variable resource, varies 1, 2, 3, 4, and the corresponding output that increases from 0 to 15. 15 is right here somewhere. 25, 32. Right, so the graph is drawn pretty much correctly up to 35. So what we observe is that as more and more units of variable resource are added to the fixed resource, to the fixed input, total product, which is just the code word for our output, which can be surgeries or cups of coffee, so total product, the output, increases at first and even at a high rate, but then the rate of increase goes down. So it still increases as we add more and more units of input, but it starts to slow down and levels off. So that's what we refer to as diminishing returns. So then every next unit of input at some point starts to produce less and less output because we are adding it to the fixed other resource. And there's a limit to which our output can increase. So one more example, production function. So in this example, Sandy owns a haircut salon with 2 chairs. So we're not even putting the number of capital resources, which is 2 chairs in this table. We're assuming that we're keeping that in mind. And she can hire up to 10 workers. So if she hires 0 people, then she produces 0 haircuts. She hires 1 person, maybe that's herself, working by herself. Then she can make 8 haircuts. She hires 1 more person. They together can make 20 haircuts. 3 people can make 34. So up to a point, the output, by hiring an extra person, you increase, you more than double output, right? As you hire the second worker from 8 to 20, which is incredible. You can see it on the graph. It increases at an increasing rate, your output. because people can specialize. People can divide up their responsibilities and work more efficiently together. But then there comes a level of production where adding a next person does not increase your output as much. And that's the story of marginal product. Remember, the marginal word, marginal means extra product of an extra worker. So all it means is that at some point, that extra product of an extra worker should start going down. It will go up for a little bit and start going, not going down, but start to decrease, and may even go down, but that would be an extreme case. Would go down and become negative when hiring the 10th worker would spoil the number of haircuts that you produce. How is that possible, right? Well, maybe people start shedding and not working. So now instead of making 75 haircuts with 9 chairs, or that 2 chairs, right? Well, yeah. And 9 people running around coloring hair and doing all that stuff. Or maybe they just become less efficient, not more. But notice that the first worker added 8 haircuts. Second worker hired 12 haircuts were added, not by that specific worker, but them together. And then the third worker was hired. 14, a whopping 14 haircuts were added. And then the fourth worker started to diminish. The product started to diminish because we're adding more and more workers to the fixed number of chairs, 2 chairs. We can put it on the graph because we're economists, we can put anything on the graph, as you may have noticed. So we are picturing the green line, marginal product of labor. So the extra product of an extra unit of labor, that's all it means. So it goes up at first and then starts to decline and then eventually may turn negative. And we could also compute average product of 2 workers, average product of 3 workers. So the output, not by an extra hired worker, but of the 3 of them together, of the 4 of them together. And it kind of almost mirrors the marginal product. When marginal product is above average, the average is rising, and the marginal product is below, the average is falling. So interesting measures. We don't know yet, or we haven't talked yet how we're using them, and maybe we'll mention it in a bit. So for now, let's look at this graph together. That total product goes up at a high rate, marginal product increases, total product increase slows down, marginal product goes down, total product falls, marginal product turns negative. And the average product is going up and going down an inverted U shape. So shape matters. We'll get back to that. And before that, we're going to look at another example. Example of various costs of production to introduce the definitions of fixed and variable costs. So suppose you're facing a decision of what to do. Pandemic. Now restaurants are going out of business. Maybe it's a good place for you to start your own business now that it's almost over, and now that you could we are getting back to normal, maybe you can start your coffee shop and make all these nice drinks with milk and not what do people put into coffee? Only like black. So maybe cream and frappuccino and Irish cream and all that stuff. So you're estimating the cost of production, the cost of starting up, the kind of running it for a year. Say we're gonna depreciate what we have for a year, and then you're trying to estimate how much revenue you might earn for a year and whether it makes sense to start this business. Or maybe you should instead start a flower shop or a daycare business, because you have alternatives, you have choices, and maybe you shouldn't even quit your own job. Let's see what happens. So we have to rent space, and suppose renting space costs $24 a year because it's about $2,000 a month. You need to buy equipment and furniture, which will last for the next 5 years, but you can depreciate it, take a 1/5 of its value, maybe 10 years, maybe suppose it's 1/10 of the value. So 160,000 you're going to spend today, but you're going to depreciate 1/10 of it. So $16,000. And then you have to pay utilities. You have to provide Wi-Fi, electric bill, water, trash, and all that. Let's just eyeball it, like $13,000 or so. You need to get food licenses and permits, $2,000. So hire an assistant, $30,000 or so. Maybe you can hire differently, pay per hour, but let's just say you are signing a contract for $30,000 or so. And you need to advertise, which will cost you $1,000. So these are your approximate fixed costs. So startup costs that you have to pay before you even produce your first cup of coffee. You agree? I hope you do. But then once you start actually making coffee, there are variable costs that you need to incur. So you will be buying cups, you'll be buying napkins, sugar, cream, or that whipped cream thing that you put on top, and some other sprinkles, and all that adds up. So that depends on the number of coffee cups you're gonna sell, but you are already estimating that realistically you will sell 360 days a year, and then every day about 60 people are gonna buy coffee. So you're gonna sell 60 cups of coffee because you're in a busy location, but not that busy. 60 realistic. So that adds up to 21,600 cups per year. That's your estimate of how many cups you're going to sell. So, and you're thinking, okay, for that many cups, that'll cost about 14,000 of everything that's variable, that depends on the cost, on the volume of production. So if you were to double that production, you'd have to double and possibly double that cost, and maybe not quite double. Depends. Maybe you'll have to pay less per unit if you order more in bulk. Who knows? But at least it does vary with the volume of output. So fixed and variable costs add up to about 100,000. So that's what you estimate. So fixed costs, the majority of that is $86,000, and the variable is about $14,000. And you can also estimate how much revenue you're going to get from selling 360 days a year, 60 customers a day. So you're estimating that each person will spend about $5 in your store on coffee. So because they're gonna buy fancy coffee, the average price is $5. Maybe there's something more expensive, something less. And so you compute that adds up to the revenue of $108,000. So your cost is 100, your revenue, expected revenue, so is 108. So you have an accounting profit right there, $8,000. So, however, you did not quite take into account the fact that you just left your job. You quit your job to start this business. So your job, suppose it pays $49,000 a year. And you also use your own savings to buy all that furniture and equipment. So $160,000 that you spent, and then you depreciated the cost. But you could have put the money in the bank, and suppose you could have gotten $1,000 per year of interest on the money. You might want to take that into account. So it's technically your implicit cost of production. So that's your opportunity cost of production. So technically everything can be called out an opportunity cost because, well, in this case, probably this is best to call your foregone salary and interest opportunity cost. And everything else we can call just explicit cost, monetary cost. So what do we see? We see that if we are to add up this $50,000 to your cost of production, then you end up in the negative territory. So it's not that you have an accounting profit of 8,000, but you have an economic profit that's negative, which is $42,000 negative. That is not something you want to do in this case, right? That's why you don't see a lot of, brain surgeons running coffee shops. Well, for them, the opportunity cost of leaving their job, or like Wall Street bankers, right, would be too high. Or maybe they can do it on the side without leaving the job. That's a different story. Maybe you could do something like this, and then your accounting will change. Your accounting won't change, but your economic profits and economic full cost will change. So let's draw the costs for the coffee shop. So let's draw variable and total fixed costs. Let's put it on the graph where the x-axis is the quantity, so the amount you produce, so the number of coffee cups you produce. So we computed the fixed cost with the red line here to be $86,000. No matter how many coffee cups you produce, the fixed cost is a constant number, even if you make a zero. So that's the whole point of fixed cost. Keep that in mind. And then we computed that the variable cost was around 14,000 or so. So the total cost, when we add this green line to the red line, we get this dark blue line, the total cost of production, and it's going up with the number quantity. But the fixed total cost really are not interesting variables. We're going to be mostly working with average per unit costs. And we need to understand how per unit of output costs change. So so what do we have? Average fixed cost. Okay, so the total fixed cost is a constant no matter how much we produce. They do not vary with the output. But if you are to compute per unit cost, so if you make 100 cups of coffee and you've just spent $86,000 setting up your coffee shop, then every cup technically has this overhead of $860, right? At your current level of estimated output of $21,600, you spread the overhead costs across all these cups, and it ends up being about $3.98, almost $4 a cup. That's what your overhead costs. notice that if you were to increase your output to 100,000 cups of coffee, so the more you produce, the more you spread the overhead expenses over more and more units. So that would be about 86 cents per cup. So cheaper and cheaper. So fixed costs become smaller and smaller per unit of output as more produced. So average total cost and average variable cost. So we saw the blue line, average fixed cost, going down as we spread more and more across the units. Now let's compute average variable costs. We have total variable cost 14,000, and we have our output of 21,600. So if we are to divide total by the output, we get the average variable cost, or variable cost per unit of per cup. So that is approximately 65 cents per cup. So as of now, as of what we have, the per cup cost of production in your coffee shop is $4.63 cents per cup. Okay, and average variable costs, they typically decrease for a period, for some range of output, and then they start to increase. And then average total cost also have this U-shaped, they're U-shaped. So they also decrease for some a range of output, and then they start to increase. Why do they start to increase? Because and why do they keep decreasing the overall cost at first? Well, the larger scale of production often allows companies to buy more supplies and pay lower price through bulk orders. But after a certain amount produced, it just you become too large. Maybe you need to pay workers overtime and hire workers to at a higher rate, or maybe it's not as easy to order even in bulk and you have to pay a higher price. So usually that's the case, but average total cost does not decrease through the entire possible level of output, but would start to increase. And your time becomes more and more expensive as you have less and less leisure. So one more example. We like examples today. We're going to look at this potential production. Oh, it says salsa, and I said beer because I took an example of salsa and thought it worked better for beer. So let's think of it as cases of beer. Bob's Gourmet Beer. So Bob is somebody who is trying to produce beer in his garage. We are the people making their own breweries in their garage. I have, although I haven't seen them in person, I've read about them. So the fixed cost is 108. So before he even starts to produce any beer, he has to buy a little bit of machinery for his brewery. And then he has to buy some hops and all this other stuff that goes into making beer, and bottles and all that. So if he makes one case, which could be a large case, case of 12 or something, then the supplies will cost him $12. Then if he makes 2 cases, so 24 bottles per unit, then it'll cost him $48 to get all his supplies. 3 cases, 108. So we're working with these numbers. So now we can compute total cost of production by summing up fixed cost and variable cost. So total cost, that's all we know, that's all we care about. Knowing the quantity and knowing the total cost, we can now compute marginal cost per case. So the number of cases increases by 1, whereas the cost increases by different number. So by 12, by 56, by 60, by 84. So the marginal cost in this example is going up for every case, for every additional case. So what else can we compute? Since we're already on the computing spree, we might as well compute something else. So total cost comes from the previous example. I will even scroll back to show you the total cost. 120, 156, 216, and we see it on this new table. So total cost. So knowing these two columns, quantity and total cost, we can now compute average total cost. We can compute average fixed cost and average variable cost, just to practice that we know what they mean. Okay, so average total cost is, you take the total cost, you divide it by the number of units of output. So we have 78 is the average cost, because we took 156 divided by 2, got a 78. Then we took 216 divided by 3 and got 72. So look at this approximate shape and picture it in your mind. It is U-shaped, just like we had in the example. U-shaped, kind of like a check mark shaped average total cost curve. Now, fixed cost must be decreasing with the quantity of produced, and we see it decreasing, right? Because we're spreading the fixed number 108 over more and more and more units produced. Average variable cost, so we computed it in the previous slide. Now we just took the variable cost and divided by the quantity. Now notice average fixed cost plus average variable cost equals average total cost. Okay, now we're gonna graph all that just because we love to graph. And we see that average fixed cost goes down, variable cost goes up kind of pretty consistently. Marginal cost also goes up, as we saw through the entire output range, and then the average total cost is check mark or U-shaped. So this way we just practiced drawing cost curves, and we also noticed that marginal cost crosses average total cost, and in fact average variable cost too, in a graph where variable cost also goes down at first, at its minimum points. So that's kind of a good way to check yourself. And we can also find the level of output that minimizes the cost of production. In this case, it's 3 cases per unit total cost of production. That's what we care about. So another way to look at the cost, typical cost curves, something we saw in the previous slide, typical shapes, but what we will see more and more often is that we'll see the cost curves have a typical shape, with average fixed cost going down, variable costs kind of having a U-shaped pattern, average total cost. It's when we add up average variable and average fixed, we get this average total cost, and the marginal cost that crosses the variable and total cost in their minimum points. And so the explanation is similar. Increasing specialization leads to lower marginal cost at first, and then diminishing returns set in, and the benefits of specializations are exhausted, so the marginal cost rises. Okay. Now, there's even more to this story. You see, there's marginal cost and average cost curves that we saw before, and we saw the marginal product and average product curves. So, and things are related. So as a marginal product of an extra worker goes up, the cost of production is going down because it's cheaper and cheaper to produce. As you add more and more workers, it's cheaper and cheaper to produce because these extra workers produce more and more per unit. More and more per unit, average product arises. Right? So average variable cost falls. And then the diminishing returns set in. Marginal product starts to decline. You add more and more workers, you pay them the same flat rate of $15 an hour, but they produce less and less per unit. So your cost goes up higher and higher per unit. So that's the story. They're quite logical and it makes sense. Now, a long run decision. So we have a short run decision, a long run decision. And in the long run, the interesting question is why is it so that some shops, we know that everything is flexible in the long run. So why is it then some businesses remain small? They have the opportunity to expand, like coffee shops, like a locksmith business, like your plumber, like your local daycare center. Why don't these businesses start growing and growing and growing to the size of Walmart? Like, why don't we see that happening? Why do we instead see that big businesses like banks are merging, that cell phone companies are merging, sometimes airlines are merging, but not plumbers and coffee shops and childcare centers. So why is it that in the long run they don't expand and expand and expand? It has something to do with the optimal scale of operation, the optimal scale of production. So suppose we are talking about a locksmith business. So the business can be pretty small, one man, one toolbox, spends money on 10 gallons of gas per week and running around, repairing locks and opening locked cars, right? So, and the average cost of production, average total cost we're talking about, is erase this first check mark shaped line. Sorry about that. So at 100 locks, around 100 locks a week. And okay, well, this guy is deciding, okay, I can expand. So we can work with a partner. We can be twice as large. We can have 2 vans instead of 1. We have 2 boxes, but now we can reach more people. But now we have to spend more than twice as much on gas. So the cost of production are actually not doubling; they're more than doubling. So if we are to double our output, it so may happen that your cost of production will more than double because you have to go out to longer and longer distances, and it takes time and expenses. So it may well be that in this business, your optimal scale of operation is actually at a low level of 100 logs. And then if you are to grow larger, your cost of production increase per unit of output. And therefore, you can sustain the competition. Somebody else will come and beat your cost of production, beat your prices, so and put you out of business. So it just does not make sense to you to grow that large. And okay, in contrast to that, let's look at a totally different business, like auto manufacturer. So automaker can produce 200 cars, or they can produce 2,000 cars, or 10,000 cars, or maybe even more, 100,000 cars. So what the difference between a locksmith and an automaker is that the setup cost for a manufacturing plant are millions and millions of dollars. Not every locksmith can afford that, right? So to start their own car manufacturing operation, there is a huge fixed setup cost of production, and if suppose it's millions of dollars, and to produce this first 200 cars, and if you were to stop at that point, then you would have to spread the millions of dollars that you've spent on setting up the business onto 100 cars, right? So that will be, $50,000 per car. Your cars are going to be really expensive. So the total cost is high, as we could see from this first squiggly U-shaped line. That's marking a potential average total cost at this scale of operation. And now imagine your scale of operation grows. So you keep producing cars. Now you're making 2,000 cars per unit of time. So you're spreading your fixed cost over 2,000 units. So now it's 10,000 or so. I don't know the exact numbers. I'm just explaining that it's going down. The more you produce, the more you spread the overheads over more and more vehicles. And then it may well be that at some point it becomes more expensive to produce more because you have to build another plant to produce more, right? So what if 10,000 is your sweet spot where you minimize the cost of production? So quite possible, right? That there is some scale of operation where you can minimize your long-term average cost of production, long run cost of production, not just short run at each scale of operation, but in general, long run cost of production. And that's what we what we mean when we say long run average cost of production is just a line that goes under all the potential possible millions of short-term cost of production that are possible, that are in your view. Like this could be your scale of operation. It could be small. It could be a little larger. It could be really large, and it could grow and grow. And so, and if your business is merged with somebody else, that is another way that your business can grow. And maybe if you are at this very, very low level of operation, and so is your similar partner, and if you merge and you move on to a larger scale business, maybe you could decrease your average total cost of production and therefore offer your customers a lower prices. So that's what low average total cost means, that you are able to offer lower prices to your customers. So yes, a rational firm considers all possible amounts of fixed cost and chooses cost that permits cheapest production. Well, but here's the trick, is that so a smaller company can take advantage of economies of scale, and as it grows, as its scale of output grows, it can reduce long run average per unit cost of production. As an example was two car manufacturers that are small in size merging together and potentially take advantage of each other's assembly line and making more cars. But as it grows, as it continues to grow, it may well hit the range of output where it can double in size, but it is no longer able to take advantage of any economies of scale because they cease to exist. So this is area of constant returns to scale, and in between output 1 and output 2 is the efficient scale of operation. So in fact, any of the output on this scale is efficient scale where your costs are minimized. So, and if you grow too large, then diseconomies of scale can set in. Why? Why could diseconomies of scale suddenly set in? Maybe because it's actually, if you're growing huge, it may be logistically hard to service all your locations. Like somehow Walmart has figured it out, and it doesn't seem like for them diseconomies of scale have kicked in yet. But if for whatever reason they were less efficient, that would have been hard to deliver goods on time, or maybe it would be hard to manage all the employees. Maybe you at some point have to grow your administrative staff and you have to pay all of the management before you pay the workers, and then managers are not that efficient. They're not really stocking your shelves, right? So maybe that's where diseconomies of scale come in. So in some industries, it may well be that the cost of production decline over the entire range of possible output, because in many industries, cost of setup, so the fixed cost of setting up production, are really high, and that applies to banking, to electricity supply, like utilities, to newspapers, right? It costs a lot of money to put together a newspapers, and a newspaper, a lot of fixed cost every day. And then you could sell it, you can just publish it for a marginal cost of 3 cents, which is paper itself, right? So in print, publish every copy, but it's the entire really cost of producing newspaper is the cost of putting together the material and paying the reporters and writing the articles and all. So industries like aircraft manufacturers and cell phone services are examples of industries where the cost of production initially, the fixed cost of production are huge, and then the more subscribers you have, or the more airplanes you produce, the more you're able to spread this cost over larger output. And such industries for which there's no diseconomies of scale in sight are called natural monopolies. Why? So they would produce natural resources, and that's why they're monopolies? No. This word means is that they naturally tend to become larger and larger because it's just cheaper to be larger, cheaper in terms of cost of production. Every time you merge with somebody else, you are able to reduce the cost of production. Because if one cell phone company merges with the other, they no longer need 2 sets of towers to maintain. They only have one headquarter set of management to maintain. they don't have to pay for 2 sets, right? So the only extra cost becomes just the cost of subscribing one more subscribers. So one more customer, which is close to 0. Okay. What we just said is this is just another way to say that in some industries, economies of scale quickly exhausted. That's the locksmith example. Could be also the coffee shop example. We don't see coffee shops the size of Walmart or daycares. So economies of scale work. You grow larger and larger. At some point, it doesn't make any more sense to grow larger because your cost starts to increase. So you hit the diseconomies of scale. And in some industries, the economies of scale persist for a giant a range of output. So you increase output until you reach that efficient scale production, and you pretty much stay there. But times change, and maybe over time the cost curves also change. And so we see mergers and acquisitions, and sometimes we actually see that companies split up. They merged before, and then they suddenly decide to split up because they realize that they've grown too big. So they've gone beyond this Q star that's on this graph. They went beyond, and their cost of production started to decrease. So they're spinning off a unit to become smaller. So this is the story of the cost of production. Now I'm going to listen to your questions. Phew, take a breath. Jump around. Do some push-ups. Relax, and then ask questions. Or did I put everybody to sleep?
No, I'm awake.
Oh.
I am awake. It sounds so, I feel like I understand it all the way up until I take the exam.
I agree.
Wow, we are observing an interesting new phenomenon. Everything is easy up until exam question. Well, okay, maybe then what I should do is bring up some problems. Next time I haven't done it, but now that you mention it, I'm going to take Monique's insight. Next time, instead of talking too much about the theory, I'm going to come up with more problems to solve. Okay?
Okay, sounds good. Now I have a question though.
That
Yeah.
sounds great.
So from the diagrams,
Yeah.
it's very easy that we can see when there is a deep down on the graphics of the average total cost. That will be the
Yeah.
point of uh,
Mm-hmm.
the minimum, how they go,
Yeah.
maximizing the output.
Mm-hmm.
How do I know whether there's a short run or long run?
Because you are, well, when you are a manager, then you're thinking long run. Long run, we can expand to whatever size we want, or we can reduce our production to whatever size we want if we have grown too large. So in the business context, you know what's short run, what's long run. On a graph, it will clearly say long run average total cost if it's long run, and if it's just average total cost, always assume it's short run.
Ah, okay.
Mm-hmm. So if you have any special questions, I can answer. Let's say there's a practice quiz question that you didn't quite get or something like that. These kind of questions I'm ready to answer, but next time I will bring my own, torture you with questions. Yeah. Well, if nothing, then I guess you can go continue to watch movies or whatever else you're doing. I'm just kidding. I'm sure you're studying economics. Okay. I'll see you next week, same time, same place. And we'll talk about perfect competition, another exciting topic.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Professor.
Okay, cool.
Good night.
Very much.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye.
Good night. Bye
Good
bye.
night.